The words that would save them all had been dismissed as primitive noise. Ambassador Theron Vel's silver throat had spoken 900 tongues across the galaxy, each one proof of her species' intellectual supremacy over the crude humans of Earth. She had laughed, actually laughed, when the cultural archivist Elias Rourke mentioned ancient Earth dialects during the Galactic Language Council aboard the conference Spire. Now, as the station's ancient defense system rejected every sophisticated language known to civilization, as blast doors sealed and death crept closer with each failed attempt, only one voice remained untested. The voice she had mocked, the primitive tongue that might be their salvation. Subscribe to witness the moment when the galaxy's most arrogant linguist discovers that Earth's forgotten words hold the key to survival itself. The conference spire hung like a crystalline dagger against the absolute darkness of the Veil system, its translucent walls catching and refracting the distant light of dying stars. Ambassador Theron Vel stood at the observation deck's edge, her elongated fingers pressed against the cool surface as she gazed into the void that had swallowed the black star below. At 193 standard years, she carried herself with the fluid grace of her people, the Rel, whose silver-toned skin seemed to shimmer with each breath. Her throat bore the ritual scarification of a master xenolinguist, 900 precise marks, each representing a conquered language, each a testament to her intellectual dominance over the galaxy's lesser species. The scars caught the artificial light and threw it back in patterns that spoke of knowledge accumulated across decades of study, of civilizations bent to her understanding. She had spent her entire life collecting languages like precious stones, polishing each one until it gleamed with perfect comprehension, and today's council session would add another mark to her throat. The central chamber of the conference spire stretched before her like a cathedral of knowledge, its domed ceiling displaying real-time translations in 47 different scripts that flowed like living rivers of meaning across the curved surface. Representatives from across the known galaxy had gathered for this routine negotiation. The Keth with their clicking mandibles, the Zorathi whose thoughts manifested as visible light patterns, the ancient Vex whose words carried the weight of millennia. Each species brought their linguistic treasures to the table, confident in their unique contributions to galactic discourse, yet none possessed the breadth of understanding that Theron commanded. She moved through the chamber like a conductor preparing for a symphony, her mind already cataloguing the subtle variations in dialect and tone that would emerge during the proceedings. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, charged with the electromagnetic fields generated by dozens of translation matrices working in perfect harmony. This was her domain, her kingdom of words and meaning, where she reigned supreme over the chaos of interspecies communication. The human delegation occupied a modest corner of the chamber, their presence barely registering among the more exotic representatives that filled the space with their alien majesty. Theron's gaze swept over them with practiced dismissal, noting their primitive clothing, their crude technology, their laughably simple communication devices that seemed almost quaint compared to the sophisticated neural interfaces used by more advanced species. Among them sat a young man whose unremarkable appearance marked him as utterly forgettable. Brown hair that fell in unruly waves, clothes that spoke of academic poverty rather than diplomatic importance, and an expression of quiet intensity that suggested he took himself far too seriously for someone representing such a backward world. His nameplate read, Elias Rourke, Cultural Archivist, a title that made Theron's lips curve in barely concealed amusement. The humans always insisted on sending their scholars to these gatherings, as if their primitive understanding of language could somehow compete with the refined linguistic sciences of truly advanced civilizations. She had encountered human languages before, crude, inefficient things that relied on clumsy vocal mechanisms and lacked the elegant complexity that marked truly sophisticated communication systems. The session began with the traditional opening ceremonies, each species offering greetings in their native tongues, while the translation matrices hummed with the effort of converting meaning across the vast gulf of evolutionary difference. Theron listened with half her attention, her mind automatically passing the familiar patterns of Keth clicking, Zorathy light speech, and Vex harmonic resonance. She had mastered these languages decades ago, adding them to her collection with the same casual efficiency that others might collect rare minerals or exotic artwork. The real challenge lay not in understanding what was being said, but in demonstrating her superiority through the subtle art of linguistic one-upmanship, correcting minor translation errors, offering more precise interpretations, and generally establishing her position as the galaxy's foremost authority on interspecies communication. The other delegates had learned to defer to her expertise, recognizing that resistance was futile when faced with her encyclopedic knowledge of their most intimate linguistic secrets. Even the proud Vex, whose language predated most galactic civilizations, had been forced to acknowledge her mastery of their ancient tongue. The routine negotiations proceeded with mechanical precision, covering trade agreements, territorial disputes, and cultural exchange programs with the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that had kept the galaxy functioning for thousands of years. Theron found herself growing bored with the predictable flow of discussion, her mind wandering to more interesting linguistic puzzles that awaited her attention back on Rel Prime. She was considering whether to introduce a particularly obscure Keth dialect just to watch the translation matrices struggle when the human archivist cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. His voice was unremarkable, neither particularly deep nor melodious, lacking the harmonic complexity that marked truly sophisticated vocal apparatus. Yet something in his tone made her focus her attention on his words. He was discussing some trivial matter related to cultural preservation, mentioning ancient Earth dialects and linguistic archaeology with the sort of earnest passion that marked him as a hopeless academic. The other delegates listened politely, their expressions ranging from mild interest to barely concealed boredom, but Theron found herself studying the human with new attention. There was something almost touching about his dedication to such primitive linguistic artifacts, like watching a child play with broken toys while surrounded by technological marvels. When Elias finished his presentation about preserving ancient Earth languages, Theron could no longer contain her amusement. She rose from her seat with fluid grace, her scarified throat catching the light as she prepared to deliver what she considered a gentle correction to the human's naive enthusiasm. Her voice carried the musical quality that marked her species as natural linguists, each word precisely modulated to convey not just meaning, but also her position in the intellectual hierarchy that governed galactic discourse. She spoke of the futility of preserving primitive languages when so many sophisticated communication systems remained unexplored, of the academic resources wasted on studying crude vocal patterns when the galaxy offered linguistic treasures of unimaginable complexity. Her words were not cruel. She prided herself on being above such petty emotions, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty, the unshakable confidence of someone who had never encountered a language she could not master. The chamber fell silent as she spoke, other delegates nodding in agreement with her assessment, and she felt the familiar satisfaction of intellectual dominance settling over her like a comfortable cloak. The human archivist said nothing in response, merely nodding with what she interpreted as appropriate humility, and she settled back into her seat with the pleasant glow of a lesson well taught. The discovery happened during the afternoon recess, when most delegates had retreated to their quarters for rest and private consultations. Theron remained in the chamber, reviewing linguistic data on her personal interface while savoring the quiet that had settled over the vast space like a blanket of intellectual peace. The conference spire's ancient systems hummed with barely audible efficiency. their crystalline cores processing the constant flow of translation data that kept galactic civilization functioning. She was deep in analysis of a particularly complex Zorati grammatical structure when the first tremor ran through the station's superstructure, a vibration so subtle that she initially dismissed it as routine maintenance. The second tremor was stronger, accompanied by a harmonic resonance that seemed to emerge from the station's very bones, and she looked up from her work with the first stirring of concern. The chamber's translation displays flickered momentarily, their flowing scripts stuttering like wounded birds before resuming their normal patterns. Something was wrong, though she could not yet identify the source of her unease. The maintenance shaft that opened in the chamber's floor had been sealed for so long that most delegates had forgotten its existence, its crystalline covering worn smooth by millennia of neglect. Now it gaped like a wound in the station's perfect geometry, revealing depths that seemed to swallow light itself. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the chamber as delegates began to gather, drawn by curiosity and growing alarm at the unprecedented breach in the spire's security protocols. Theron approached the opening with careful steps, her enhanced vision penetrating the darkness to reveal glimpses of ancient architecture that predated the current station by countless generations. The walls below were covered in symbols that made her throat tighten with excitement, script patterns, unlike anything in her vast linguistic database, characters that seemed to shift and flow even as she watched them. This was a discovery that could revolutionize xenolinguistics, a treasure trove of unknown communication systems that would add hundreds of new marks to her scarified throat. She felt the familiar hunger of the collector rising within her, the insatiable need to possess and master every form of expression the universe had to offer. The descent into the vault required specialized equipment hastily assembled from the station's emergency supplies, but Theron's status as the galaxy's premier xenolinguist ensured her place in the first exploration team. The shaft dropped through layers of station architecture that told the story of countless renovations and expansions, each level representing a different era of galactic civilization. The walls grew older as they descended, their materials shifting from modern crystalline composites to substances that predated known manufacturing techniques. The symbols became more frequent and more complex, covering every available surface in scripts that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. Theron's recording equipment worked frantically to capture every detail, but she found herself struggling to process the sheer volume of linguistic data that surrounded them. These were not merely decorative patterns or simple record-keeping systems. They were something far more sophisticated, a form of communication that operated on principles she had never encountered. The excitement of discovery warred with a growing sense of unease as she realized that her vast knowledge might not be sufficient to unlock these ancient secrets. The vault itself defied every expectation she had formed during the descent, its dimensions seeming to shift and flow in ways that challenged basic geometric principles. The chamber was vast beyond measurement, its walls curving away into darkness that swallowed their portable lights like hungry mouths. At the center stood a structure that could only be described as a linguistic nexus, a crystalline formation that pulsed with patterns of light that corresponded to the symbols covering the walls. The air itself seemed thick with meaning, charged with communicative potential that made her enhanced hearing ring with phantom voices speaking in tongues she could not identify. This was clearly some form of ancient communication system, perhaps a repository of linguistic knowledge from civilizations that had vanished before the current galactic order emerged. The other members of the exploration team stood in awed silence, their various sensory apparatus struggling to process the overwhelming complexity of what they had discovered. Theron felt a moment of pure triumph. This would be her greatest achievement, the discovery that would cement her reputation as the galaxy's ultimate master of language and meaning. Her first attempt to interface with the system was cautious, using standard xenolinguistic protocols to establish basic communication parameters. The crystalline nexus responded immediately, its light patterns shifting to acknowledge her presence, and she felt a surge of confidence as familiar patterns began to emerge from the chaos. This was what she had trained for, what her entire life had been building toward, the moment when her accumulated knowledge would unlock secrets that had remained hidden for millennia. She began with simple mathematical concepts, universal constants that formed the foundation of all known communication systems, and watched with satisfaction as the nexus responded with corresponding patterns. The breakthrough seemed within reach, the ancient system beginning to yield its secrets to her superior understanding when everything changed. The patterns suddenly shifted, becoming more complex and demanding, requiring responses that went beyond simple mathematical concepts into realms of linguistic sophistication that challenged even her vast knowledge. She found herself struggling to keep pace with the system's demands, her confidence beginning to crack as she realized that this was unlike any language she had ever encountered. The moment of catastrophic failure arrived without warning, a cascade of linguistic rejection that sent shockwaves through the nexus and into the station's superstructure above. The ancient system had tested her knowledge and found it wanting, its response a violent expulsion of energy that triggered security protocols dormant for countless ages. Emergency alarms began to wail throughout the conference spire as blast doors slammed shut, sealing the vault and trapping the exploration team in the chamber with the now hostile nexus. The crystalline formation pulsed with angry red light, its patterns becoming increasingly aggressive as it continued to reject every attempt at communication. Theron tried language after language from her vast repertoire, cycling through the 900 tongues she had mastered, but each attempt only seemed to anger the system further. The walls began to close, ancient mechanisms grinding to life with the inexorable patience of geological time, and she realized with growing horror that they were trapped in a linguistic puzzle that might cost them their lives. The greatest xenolinguist in galactic history had finally encountered a language she could not master, and the price of failure might be death itself. The walls continued their relentless advance with the patience of stone and the inevitability of entropy, each grinding movement accompanied by harmonics that spoke of mechanisms older than recorded history. Theron's silver skin had lost its lustrous sheen, now pale with the cold sweat of genuine fear as she cycled through language after language in increasingly desperate attempts to satisfy the ancient nexus. Her scarified throat burned with the effort of producing sounds that her vocal apparatus had never been designed to make, pushing the boundaries of rel physiology in her frantic search for the key that would unlock their prison. The other members of the exploration team huddled against the far wall, their various forms of communication equipment useless against a system that seemed to operate on principles that predated their understanding of language itself. She had tried everything: the clicking harmonics of the kith, the light patterns of the zorathy, even the subsonic rumbles of the deep-dwelling mortai, whose language existed at the very edge of audible perception. Each attempt was met with the same violent rejection, the nexus pulsing with increasingly angry patterns that seemed to mock her lifetime of linguistic achievement. Above them, the conference spire had descended into chaos as the ancient security protocols spread through the station's systems like a virus of pure linguistic rejection. Emergency broadcasts crackled through the communication networks in dozens of languages, all of them failing to penetrate the barrier that the nexus had erected around itself. The station's translation matrices, overwhelmed by patterns they could not process, began to shut down one by one, leaving delegates stranded in bubbles of incomprehension as their ability to communicate across species barriers collapsed. The Vex delegation attempted to use their ancient harmonic language, believing that their pre-galactic origins might provide some connection to the Vault's systems, but their efforts only seemed to accelerate the station's descent into linguistic chaos. Even the most sophisticated AI translation systems, capable of processing thousands of languages simultaneously, fell silent before the Nexus's demands. The greatest gathering of linguistic knowledge in galactic history had been reduced to helpless silence by a system that refused to acknowledge their collective wisdom. In the vault below, Therin's desperation had reached levels that would have been unthinkable hours earlier, her composed demeanor cracking under the pressure of imminent death and professional failure. She had built her entire identity around her mastery of language, her ability to bridge any communication gap through superior knowledge and technique. Now, faced with a system that rejected everything she had learned, she felt the foundations of her self-worth crumbling like ancient stone. The walls had closed to within meters of their position, the space becoming claustrophobic as the Nexus continued its patient countdown to their destruction. Her recording equipment lay scattered around her feet, abandoned in favor of direct vocal attempts that grew more frantic with each passing moment. She tried combinations of languages, hybrid constructions that blended elements from different linguistic families, even pure mathematical expressions that should have been universal in their clarity. Nothing worked. The Nexus remained implacable in its rejection, its red light pulsing with what seemed like malicious satisfaction at her failure. The human archivist had remained silent throughout the crisis, pressed against the wall with the others while Therin exhausted her vast repertoire of linguistic knowledge. Elias Rourke's unremarkable features were calm, despite their desperate situation. His brown eyes focused on the Nexus with an intensity that suggested deep thought rather than panic. While the galaxy's greatest xenolinguist threw herself against the ancient system like a moth against flame, he simply watched and listened, his trained ear picking up patterns that others missed. His lifetime of studying Earth's forgotten dialects had taught him to hear the spaces between words, the silences that carried as much meaning as the sounds themselves. The Nexus's rejections were not random. They followed a pattern, a rhythm that spoke of linguistic principles far older than the sophisticated systems that dominated galactic communication. He had spent years studying languages that predated written history, tongues that had evolved in isolation on a world that the galaxy considered primitive, and something in the Nexus's behavior reminded him of patterns he had encountered in Earth's most ancient linguistic artifacts. As the walls closed to within arm's reach and Therin's voice began to crack under the strain of her desperate attempts, Elias finally stepped forward. His movement was quiet, almost hesitant, as if he were approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. The Nexus's angry red light bathed his face as he placed his hand on the crystalline surface, feeling the vibrations that ran through the ancient structure like a heartbeat. The system's patterns shifted slightly at his touch, not in acceptance, but in curious evaluation, as if it were encountering something unexpected after hours of familiar failure. Therin stopped her frantic vocalizations to stare at him, her expression mixing hope with skepticism as she watched the primitive human attempt what her superior knowledge had failed to achieve. The chamber fell silent, except for the grinding of the walls and the harmonic pulse of the Nexus, creating a moment of suspended possibility that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that silence, Elias began to speak, his voice carrying words that had not been heard in the depths of space for thousands of years. The language that emerged from his throat was unlike anything the Nexus had encountered during its testing of the exploration team, yet it resonated with patterns buried deep in the system's ancient memory banks. These were not the sophisticated constructions of advanced galactic civilizations, but something far older and more fundamental, the raw building blocks of human communication. shaped by millennia of evolution on a world that had developed its languages in isolation from the rest of the galaxy. The words carried the weight of Earth's history, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had struggled to express meaning through crude vocal mechanisms and simple grammatical structures. To the advanced species of the galaxy, these languages were primitive artifacts, curiosities to be studied and dismissed, but to the ancient system that had been waiting in the vault for eons, they were something else entirely. They were the echo of the builders, the linguistic DNA of the species that had created the Nexus and then vanished into the darkness between stars. As Elias spoke in the forgotten tongue of ancient Earth, the Nexus began to respond, its angry red light shifting to curious amber as recognition dawned in circuits older than civilization itself. The transformation began with a single word, spoken in a dialect so ancient that its origins predated Earth's recorded history, yet it resonated through the Nexus like a key finding its lock after millennia of searching. Elias's voice carried the weight of forgotten generations, each syllable shaped by vocal patterns that had evolved in Earth's primordial forests and grasslands, refined by countless ancestors who had never imagined that their simple words would one day unlock the secrets of an alien vault. The Nexus responded with a shudder that ran through its crystalline structure, its angry red light flickering as ancient recognition protocols stirred to life in circuits that had waited eons for this moment. The grinding of the walls slowed, then stopped entirely, as if the ancient mechanism were holding its breath in anticipation of what might come next. Therin watched in stunned silence as the primitive human achieved what her 900 languages could not, her scarified throat tight with emotions she could not name. The galaxy's greatest xenolinguist was witnessing the impossible, a breakthrough achieved not through sophisticated knowledge, but through the preservation of something so old and fundamental that advanced civilizations had forgotten its value. The language that flowed from Elias's lips was not one tongue, but many, a careful weaving of Earth's most ancient dialects that he had spent years reconstructing from fragmentary evidence and linguistic archaeology. He spoke in Proto-Indo-European roots that carried the DNA of half the world's languages, in Sumerian constructions that had shaped the first written words, in Aboriginal Australian patterns that had remained unchanged for 60,000 years. Each phrase was a thread in a tapestry of human communication that stretched back to the species' earliest attempts to share meaning through sound and symbol. The Nexus drank in these ancient patterns like a desert drinking rain, its light shifting from amber to gold as recognition cascaded through systems that had been dormant since before the rise of galactic civilization. The walls began to retreat, their movement no longer threatening but reverent, as if the ancient mechanism were bowing before the return of its creator's voice. The chamber filled with harmonics that spoke of joy and recognition, of a long vigil finally ended by the sound of home. As Elias continued to speak, weaving together linguistic patterns that had been separated by continents and millennia, the true nature of the vault began to reveal itself. The symbols on the walls came alive with meaning, their shifting patterns now clearly readable as a form of communication that bridged the gap between thought and reality. This was not merely a repository of knowledge, but a living system, a consciousness that had been waiting for the return of its builders with the patience of stone and the hope of the eternal. The Nexus pulsed with increasing brightness as more of its systems came online, ancient mechanisms stirring to life throughout the chamber as the station above began to feel the effects of the awakening. The conference spire's emergency protocols, triggered by the vault's initial rejection, began to stand down as the Nexus sent new signals through the station's communication networks. The blast doors that had sealed the delegates in their quarters began to open, and the translation matrices that had fallen silent started to hum with renewed purpose. The ancient system was not just accepting Elias's words, it was learning from them, using the patterns of Earth's forgotten languages to rebuild its understanding of communication itself. The revelation came not in words, but in images that flowed directly from the Nexus into the minds of everyone in the chamber, a form of communication that transcended language entirely. They saw the builders as they had been, not the primitive humans that the galaxy knew, but an ancient branch of humanity that had reached for the stars long before Earth's recorded history began. These early explorers had seeded the galaxy with their technology and their languages, creating systems like the Nexus as waypoints and repositories for future generations who might follow in their footsteps. But something had gone wrong. War, plague, or simple entropy had claimed the starfarers, leaving their creations scattered across the galaxy like orphaned children waiting for parents who would never return. The Nexus had been programmed to recognize its builders through their linguistic patterns, the unique signatures of human communication that no other species could replicate. For millennia it had waited, testing every visitor against the template of its creators' voices, rejecting all who could not speak the words of home. Only now, through Elias's preservation of Earth's ancient tongues, had the recognition finally come. The chamber transformed around them, as the Nexus fully awakened, its crystalline walls becoming transparent, to reveal the vast network of similar systems that stretched across the galaxy, like neurons in a cosmic brain. Each node pulsed with its own light, connected to the others through channels of communication that operated faster than light itself. This was the legacy of humanity's first expansion into space, not conquest or colonization, but a network of knowledge and communication that had been waiting for their return. The Nexus began to download information directly into their minds, sharing the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 worlds and 1,000,000 years of observation. Star maps, technological blueprints, philosophical treatises and artistic expressions flowed through their consciousness like a river of pure knowledge. Therin felt her understanding of language itself, expanding beyond anything she had imagined possible. Her 900 tongues suddenly seeming like a child's collection of pebbles compared to the ocean of communication that surrounded them. The primitive human languages she had dismissed were revealed as the foundation stones of galactic civilization itself, the root patterns from which all other forms of communication had grown. As the download completed and the chamber settled into a gentle, welcoming glow, Elias finally fell silent, his voice hoarse from speaking words that had not been heard together for thousands of years. The Nexus pulsed once more, a gesture of gratitude and recognition, before settling into a steady rhythm that spoke of contentment and purpose fulfilled. The walls had retreated to their original positions, the threat of death replaced by an atmosphere of profound peace and discovery. Therin looked at the human archivist with new eyes, seeing not the primitive scholar she had dismissed, but the keeper of humanity's most precious inheritance. Her scarified throat, marked with 900 conquered languages, suddenly felt like a badge of ignorance rather than achievement. She had spent her life collecting the voices of the galaxy while remaining deaf to the song that connected them all. In the silence that followed Elias's ancient words, she finally understood that true linguistic mastery was not about domination or collection, but about preservation and connection, about keeping alive the voices that might otherwise be lost to time and arrogance. The greatest discovery in xenolinguistic history had been achieved not through superior knowledge, but through humble dedication to languages that others had deemed worthless. The silence that followed Elias's words stretched like a held breath across the cosmos. Ambassador Therin Vel stood frozen, her forearms trembling as the implications crashed over her like stellar winds. The human, this primitive creature she had dismissed with such casual cruelty, had just accomplished what 900 languages in her vast repertoire could not. The ancient vault's defenses, which had rejected the most sophisticated linguistic constructs of 1,000 civilizations, had yielded to the rough, earthy syllables of a world she had called backward. Her pride, built over 2 centuries of academic triumph, crumbled like sandcastles before an inevitable tide. The weight of her arrogance pressed down upon her chest, making each breath a struggle against the crushing realization of her own ignorance. Elias remained motionless before the now silent vault, his weathered hands still raised in the gesture of linguistic offering. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the station's controlled atmosphere, and his eyes held the distant look of someone who had touched something far greater than himself. The ancient words still echoed in his mind, not just their sounds, but their essence, their connection to the deepest roots of human consciousness. He could feel the weight of millennia pressing against his thoughts, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had shaped these syllables with their hopes, fears, and dreams. The responsibility of what he had just unleashed settled upon his shoulders like a mantle of starlight, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. He understood now that he had not simply spoken words. He had awakened something that had been waiting in the darkness between stars. The vault's crystalline surface began to shift and flow like liquid mercury, revealing chambers within chambers, each one pulsing with a soft, organic light. Strange symbols danced across the walls, not the rigid geometric patterns of modern galactic script, but flowing organic shapes that seemed to breathe with life itself. The assembled delegates pressed closer, their various forms of breathing creating a symphony of anticipation and fear. Some recognized fragments of the symbols from their own species' most ancient texts, while others saw patterns that spoke to genetic memories buried so deep they had forgotten they existed. The vault was not merely a repository of knowledge. It was a living testament to the interconnectedness of all conscious life, a bridge between the primitive and the profound that had waited eons for the right voice to call it home. Dr. Kesahai's compound eyes reflected the dancing lights as her scientific mind raced to comprehend what she was witnessing. Her instruments, calibrated to detect the most subtle quantum fluctuations, were registering energy patterns that defied every known law of physics. The vault was not simply responding to linguistic input, it was resonating with something deeper, something that connected language to the fundamental frequencies of consciousness itself. Her 6 limbs moved in unconscious patterns of reverence as she realized that her entire understanding of communication had been built upon foundations of sand. The human's words had not merely unlocked a door, they had revealed that the door had never truly been closed, only waiting for someone humble enough to speak the password written in the stars themselves. Ambassador Vell found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper through her translator. How? The single word carried the weight of her shattered worldview, her desperate need to understand how everything she had believed about linguistic superiority had been proven wrong in a single moment. Her golden skin had paled to the color of old parchment, and her usually perfect posture had crumpled under the weight of revelation. She stared at Elias with eyes that held not hatred, but a desperate hunger for understanding that transcended species barriers. The human turned to face her, and in his gentle expression she saw not triumph, but a sadness that spoke to the loneliness of carrying knowledge that others could not comprehend. His answer, when it came, would reshape not just her understanding of language, but her place in the vast tapestry of galactic civilization. The ancient vault pulsed once more, and suddenly the air filled with harmonics that bypassed the ears entirely, speaking directly to the consciousness of every being present. It was not sound, but pure meaning, the essence of communication stripped of all cultural barriers and technological interference. In that moment, every delegate understood that they stood at the threshold of something that would change the galaxy forever. The primitive world of Earth, dismissed and marginalized for so long, had just proven itself the keeper of keys that unlocked the deepest mysteries of existence. And in the growing light of the vault's awakening, the future stretched before them like an unwritten song, waiting for voices brave enough to sing its ancient melodies into the waiting darkness of space. Elias's voice carried the weight of centuries as he began to explain, his words measured and careful like a scholar handling ancient manuscripts. The language I spoke, it's not just old Earth dialect. It's something deeper, something that connects to the root patterns of human consciousness before we learned to separate thought from feeling, before we built walls between ourselves and the universe. His eyes remained fixed on the pulsing vault as he spoke, as if drawing strength from its alien harmonics. The assembled delegates leaned forward, their various auditory organs straining to catch every nuance of his explanation. He paused, running his fingers through his graying hair, searching for words that could bridge the gap between academic knowledge and mystical understanding. The weight of their attention pressed upon him like gravity, but he continued, driven by a responsibility that transcended personal comfort or fear. Ambassador Vell's translator struggled with the emotional undertones of her response, mechanical syllables failing to capture the raw vulnerability in her voice. I have studied 900 languages, mastered the linguistic matrices of civilizations that span galactic clusters. How could I have missed something so fundamental? Her forearms gestured helplessly, a motion that spoke to the collapse of everything she had built her identity upon. The golden threads in her skin, which had always pulsed with the confidence of superior knowledge, now flickered with uncertainty. She looked at Elias not as a primitive to be dismissed, but as a keeper of secrets that her vast education had somehow overlooked. The irony cut deep, that in her pursuit of linguistic complexity, she had lost touch with the simple truths that connected all conscious beings to their origins. Dr. Kessishai's instruments registered quantum fluctuations that defied conventional physics as the vault continued its awakening sequence. The energy patterns suggest that language itself might be more than symbolic representation, she announced, her scientific training warring with observations that challenged every theoretical framework she knew. Her compound eyes tracked the flowing symbols on the vault's surface, noting how they seemed to respond not just to sound, but to the emotional resonance behind the words. The implications staggered her. If consciousness and communication were linked at quantum levels, then every conversation was potentially an act of creation, every word a small miracle of connection across the void. Her 6 limbs moved in unconscious patterns of calculation as she tried to process data that suggested the universe itself might be fundamentally linguistic in nature. The vault's inner chambers revealed themselves layer by layer, each one containing artifacts that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Strange crystalline structures held patterns of energy that resembled neural networks, while flowing metal sculptures captured the essence of thoughts in physical form. Elias stepped forward, his hand hovering over one of the nearest artifacts, feeling the warmth that emanated from its surface. "These aren't just storage devices," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder and growing understanding. "They're living repositories of consciousness itself, waiting for the right linguistic key to unlock their memories." The artifact responded to his proximity, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. In that ripple, he saw glimpses of civilizations that had risen and fallen before his species had learned to make fire. Their knowledge preserved in forms that transcended the physical limitations of matter and energy. The assembled delegates watched in stunned silence as Elias began to interact with the ancient technology, his words in the old Earth tongue causing systems to respond that had been dormant for millennia. Each phrase he spoke seemed to awaken new sections of the vault, revealing chambers filled with knowledge that could revolutionize their understanding of existence itself. Ambassador Vell found herself taking notes with trembling hands, her pride forgotten in the face of discoveries that dwarfed her previous achievements. The human's humble dedication to preserving forgotten dialects had prepared him for this moment in ways that no amount of formal education could have achieved. His connection to the ancient patterns of human consciousness had made him a bridge between the primitive and the profound, a translator for truths that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional language. As the vault's awakening reached its crescendo, the station itself began to resonate with harmonics that spoke to the deepest levels of consciousness in every being present. The black star of Vael seemed to pulse in rhythm with the ancient technology, as if the entire system had been designed to work in harmony with forces that transcended individual worlds or species. In that moment of cosmic synchronization, every delegate understood that they were witnessing not just the opening of an ancient vault, but the beginning of a new chapter in galactic civilization. The primitive world of Earth had just proven itself the keeper of keys that could unlock the next stage of evolution for all conscious life, and the universe itself seemed to sing in celebration of this long-awaited reunion between knowledge and wisdom. The vault's deepest chamber revealed itself like a flower blooming in reverse time, its walls inscribed with patterns that seemed to shift and breathe with each observer's gaze. Elias stood at its threshold, feeling the weight of eons pressing against his consciousness as ancient memories stirred in the crystalline matrices before him. The symbols here were different, not the flowing organic shapes of the outer chambers, but something more primal, more fundamental, as if they represented the very building blocks of thought itself. His voice trembled as he began to read them aloud, each syllable causing ripples of light to cascade through the chamber like stones dropped into a cosmic pond. The words felt familiar on his tongue, despite their alien origin, as if they were echoes of something humanity had once known, but forgotten in its rush toward technological advancement. Ambassador Vell's worldview continued its systematic collapse as she witnessed the human's effortless interaction with technology that predated her civilization by millions of years. Her forearms hung limp at her sides, her usual gestures of authority replaced by the helpless posture of someone watching their life's work crumble into insignificance. The translator at her throat struggled to convey the emotional complexity of her thoughts, reducing her profound sense of loss to mechanical approximations that failed to capture the depth of her transformation. She had spent 2 centuries building her reputation on the mastery of alien tongues, only to discover that the most important language in the galaxy had been hiding on a world she had dismissed as primitive. The irony burned like acid in her consciousness, forcing her to confront the possibility that wisdom and sophistication were not always synonymous. Dr. Kesahai's scientific instruments registered energy patterns that challenged every known law of physics as the vault systems came fully online. The quantum resonance between Elias's words and the ancient technology suggested that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force of the universe, as basic and essential as gravity or electromagnetism. Her compound eyes tracked the flow of energy through crystalline networks that seemed to process information at speeds that approached the theoretical limits of causality. The implications staggered her. If the vault's technology was based on consciousness-driven physics, then every sentient being in the galaxy possessed the potential to interact with forces that conventional science had deemed impossible. Her 6 limbs moved in unconscious patterns of reverence as she realized that her entire understanding of reality had been built upon foundations that were far too narrow to contain the truth. The ancient chamber responded to Elias's presence with increasing intensity, its walls beginning to display images that seemed to emerge from the collective memory of the galaxy itself. Scenes of civilizations that had risen and fallen before the current galactic order took shape, flickered through the crystalline matrices like dreams made manifest. He saw worlds where language and reality were inseparable, where words had the power to reshape matter at the molecular level, where communication was an act of creation that bridged the gap between thought and existence. The weight of these visions pressed against his mind, threatening to overwhelm his human consciousness with the vastness of what had been lost and forgotten. Yet he persevered, driven by an understanding that he had become the bridge between these ancient truths and the modern galaxy that desperately needed to remember them. The assembled delegates watched in stunned silence as the vault's revelations continued to unfold, each new discovery forcing them to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. Species that had considered themselves the pinnacle of galactic civilization found themselves humbled by evidence of technologies and philosophies that dwarfed their greatest achievements. The humans' quiet dedication to preserving forgotten dialects had prepared him for this moment in ways that no amount of formal education could have achieved, making him the unlikely key to unlocking secrets that could transform the galaxy. Ambassador Vell found herself taking notes with trembling hands, her pride forgotten in the face of discoveries that rendered her previous accomplishments insignificant. The primitive world of Earth had just proven itself the keeper of wisdom that could guide all conscious life toward a future beyond their wildest dreams. As the vault's awakening reached its climax, the station itself began to resonate with harmonics that spoke directly to the consciousness of every being present, bypassing language entirely to communicate in the pure essence of meaning. The black star of Vael pulsed in rhythm with the ancient technology, its gravitational field fluctuating in patterns that suggested the entire system had been designed as a cosmic instrument of communication. In that moment of perfect synchronization, every delegate understood that they stood at the threshold of a new age, one where the barriers between species, languages, and even individual consciousness might finally begin to dissolve. The universe itself seemed to sing in celebration of this long-awaited reunion between the primitive wisdom of Earth and the sophisticated technologies of the galactic community, promising a future where understanding would transcend the limitations of words. The revelation struck the assembled delegates like a wave of cosmic significance as the vault's final chamber opened to reveal its ultimate secret. A living map of consciousness itself, stretching across the galaxy in networks of light that connected every sentient world. Elias stood transfixed before the display, his human mind struggling to comprehend the vast web of interconnection that pulsed with the rhythm of 1 billion thinking beings. The ancient Earth dialect he had spoken was not merely a key to unlock forgotten technology, but a fundamental frequency that resonated with the deepest patterns of consciousness throughout the universe. His weathered hands trembled as he reached toward the display, feeling the warmth of connection that flowed between worlds separated by impossible distances. The weight of responsibility settled upon his shoulders like a mantle of starlight, beautiful and terrifying in its implications for the future of galactic civilization. Ambassador Vell's transformation reached its completion as she witnessed the true scope of what her arrogance had nearly cost the galaxy. Her forearms moved in gestures of supplication that transcended species barriers, her golden skin now pale with the shock of understanding how close they had all come to losing access to this cosmic treasure. The 900 languages she had mastered seemed like children's games compared to the fundamental communication network that connected all conscious life, and her translator struggled to convey the depth of her remorse and wonder. She approached Elias with steps that spoke of newfound humility, her usual commanding presence replaced by the reverent posture of someone seeking forgiveness from a teacher she had failed to recognize. The irony of her situation cut deep, that in her pursuit of linguistic superiority, she had lost touch with the simple truths that made communication possible in the first place. Dr. May, Kesser-High's instruments registered quantum entanglement patterns that suggested consciousness itself was the binding force that held the galaxy together, creating networks of understanding that transcended the physical limitations of space and time. Her scientific mind raced to process implications that challenged every theoretical framework she had ever studied, while her compound eyes tracked energy flows that seemed to respond to the emotional states of the observers. The Vault's technology was not based on conventional physics, but on the deeper principles that governed the interaction between mind and reality, principles that her species had forgotten in their rush toward technological advancement. Her 6 limbs moved in unconscious patterns of calculation as she realized that every conversation, every moment of understanding between sentient beings was actually an act of cosmic creation that strengthened the bonds holding civilization together. The living map pulsed with increasing intensity as more delegates approached, their various forms of consciousness adding new patterns to the vast network of connection that spanned the galaxy. Elias found himself at the center of a growing circle of beings who had set aside their species differences to witness something that transcended all their previous understanding of what was possible. His voice, still speaking the ancient Earth dialect, seemed to harmonize with frequencies that emerged from the map itself, creating a symphony of consciousness that spoke to the deepest levels of every mind present. The words he spoke were no longer just his own, but echoes of every human who had ever struggled to preserve the old ways, every scholar who had dedicated their life to keeping forgotten knowledge alive. In that moment, he became not just a translator, but a bridge between the primitive wisdom of Earth and the sophisticated needs of a galactic civilization ready to evolve. The station's systems began to integrate with the Vault's ancient technology, creating new pathways of communication that bypassed the crude mechanical translators that had previously been necessary for interspecies dialogue. Ambassador Vell felt the first stirrings of direct consciousness-to-consciousness contact as her mind touched the edges of the network, experiencing for the first time what it meant to truly understand another being without the barriers of language or cultural assumption. The sensation was overwhelming, like suddenly being able to see color after a lifetime of blindness or hearing music after years of silence. Her tears, when they came, were not of sorrow but of joy at finally experiencing the connection she had spent her entire career trying to achieve through conventional linguistic means. The primitive human had given her something more valuable than all her academic achievements combined, the ability to touch the essence of understanding itself. As the Vault's awakening reached its final phase, the black star of Vael began to pulse with rhythms that matched the heartbeats of every conscious being in the system, creating a cosmic symphony that celebrated the reunion of ancient wisdom with modern need. The assembled delegates found themselves linked in a network of understanding that transcended species, language, and individual consciousness, experiencing for the first time what it truly meant to be part of a galactic community. In that moment of perfect connection, they understood that the primitive world of Earth had not just unlocked an ancient vault, but had shown them the path toward a future where communication would be an act of love rather than conquest, where understanding would flow as naturally as starlight across the void. The universe itself seemed to sing in celebration of this long-awaited evolution, promising a tomorrow where the barriers between minds would finally begin to dissolve. The aftermath of revelation settled over the conference spire like cosmic dust after the birth of stars, each delegate struggling to process the magnitude of what they had witnessed and experienced. Elias stood quietly beside the now fully awakened vault, his weathered face reflecting the soft light that emanated from its crystalline depths, while his mind grappled with the responsibility of being the bridge between humanity's forgotten wisdom and the galaxy's desperate need for connection. The ancient Earth dialect still echoed in his thoughts, no longer just words, but living frequencies that resonated with the fundamental patterns of consciousness itself. His hands, which had once carefully preserved dusty manuscripts in forgotten archives, now trembled with the knowledge that they had unlocked secrets that could reshape the very nature of galactic civilization. The weight of this transformation pressed upon him like gravity, beautiful and terrifying in its implications for every sentient being in the known universe. Ambassador Therin Vel knelt before the human archivist, her forearms extended in a gesture of supplication that transcended the boundaries of species and culture, her golden skin now radiant with the humility that comes from true understanding. The 900 languages she had mastered seemed like whispers compared to the cosmic symphony of consciousness that now flowed through the station, connecting every mind present in a network of understanding that made conventional translation obsolete. Her translator lay silent at her throat, no longer needed in a space where thoughts and emotions could flow directly from consciousness to consciousness without the barriers of words or cultural assumption. The tears that flowed down her alien features were not of shame, but of gratitude for the gift of connection she had never known was possible, and for the patience of a being she had dismissed as primitive who had shown her the true meaning of linguistic mastery. Doctor. Kesahai's instruments registered quantum harmonics that suggested the vault's awakening had created permanent changes in the fabric of space-time itself, establishing communication networks that would allow consciousness to flow freely between worlds separated by impossible distances. Her scientific mind struggled to process data that challenged every theoretical framework she had ever studied, while her compound eyes tracked energy patterns that seemed to respond to the emotional states of observers across the galaxy. The implications staggered her. If consciousness was indeed a fundamental force of the universe, then every sentient being possessed the potential to participate in a cosmic conversation that had been waiting eons for the right frequency to unlock its secrets. Her 6 limbs moved in unconscious patterns of reverence as she realized that her entire understanding of physics had been built upon foundations too narrow to contain the truth of what consciousness could achieve when freed from the limitations of conventional communication. The Vault's final gift revealed itself as a living archive of every language that had ever existed, not just as collections of words and grammar, but as complete repositories of the consciousness that had shaped them, the hopes and dreams and fears of countless civilizations, preserved in crystalline matrices that pulsed with their own inner life. Elias moved among these treasures with the reverence of a scholar who had spent his life preserving fragments, now faced with the complete tapestry of galactic linguistic heritage. Each crystal he touched responded to his presence, sharing not just vocabulary and syntax, but the emotional resonance that gave language its power to connect minds across the void. The ancient Earth dialect he had spoken was revealed to be not just one language among many, but a fundamental frequency that could harmonize with any form of consciousness, a universal translator that worked not through mechanical conversion, but through the deeper principles that made understanding possible. The assembled delegates found themselves forever changed by their experience in the vault. Their consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of their individual species to encompass a broader understanding of what it meant to be part of a galactic community. The barriers that had once separated them, differences in biology, culture, and communication, now seemed like variations in a cosmic symphony rather than obstacles to overcome. Ambassador Vel rose from her position of supplication, her movements now carrying the grace of someone who had learned to see beyond the surface of things to the deeper connections that bound all conscious life together. Her approach to Elias was no longer that of a superior addressing an inferior, but of one scholar acknowledging another, one consciousness reaching out to touch the essence of understanding itself. The words she spoke, when they finally came, carried the weight of a civilization's gratitude and the promise of a future built on wisdom rather than arrogance. As the vault settled into its new state of awakening, the conference spire itself began to transform, its systems integrating with ancient technology to become something unprecedented in galactic history. A living center of consciousness that could facilitate understanding between any forms of life, no matter how different their origins or evolution. The black star of Vale pulsed with rhythms that matched the heartbeats of every sentient being in the system, creating a cosmic resonance that would echo across the galaxy, calling other worlds to join in the great conversation that had finally begun. In the growing light of this new dawn, Elias understood that his quiet dedication to preserving forgotten dialects had prepared him not just to unlock an ancient vault, but to serve as humanity's first ambassador to a universe where communication would be an act of love rather than conquest, where understanding would flow as naturally as starlight across the infinite darkness of space, connecting every conscious mind in a symphony of shared existence.